1865 in Virginia. The air was heavy, with the aftermath of the Civil War. Smoke still clung to the fields, and the ground bore the scars of battles fought only months before. Families were rebuilding, fortunes lost, and society shifting under the weight of a defeated Confederacy. Among the sprawling plantations of central Virginia, one estate stood rigidly proud, untouched by the chaos that had swallowed others. The Hawthorne estate belonged to Jonathan Hawthorne, a man of wealth and influence, known in the county for his unyielding will and obsession with social status. Jonathan's only daughter, Eleanor Hawthorne, was 17. She had grown into a girl of rare beauty, her golden hair and soft blue eyes a stark contrast to the harshness of her father's character. Eleanor had been raised in a world of privilege, yet also one of strict rules, where obedience was prized above happiness and appearances outweighed all else. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 10, leaving the girl vulnerable to her father's authoritarian ways. Jonathan, convinced that no suitor could ever match the family's reputation, had developed a disturbing obsession with controlling every aspect of her life. From the very beginning, he saw Eleanor not as a daughter with feelings, but as a tool. He wanted to secure alliances, wealth, and the appearance of moral superiority. As Eleanor blossomed into young womanhood, Jonathan's expectations grew darker. He was no longer content with guiding her choices. He wanted to dictate them with iron certainty. Indifferent to the heartbreak it would bring her, the daughter, unaware of the storm that loomed, spent her days wandering the gardens, sketching the deer that roamed the estate, and reading the few books left untouched in the library. She believed in kindness and fairness, having learned the soft ways of the world from her mother's gentle letters, now worn and yellowed with age. Eleanor had friends among the neighboring families, boys and girls who admired her spirit and warmth. Yet, as Jonathan observed her, he interpreted her charm as a weakness, a trait that could be exploited to serve his ambitions. It was on a late autumn afternoon when the first seed of cruelty took root. Jonathan called Eleanor to the study, a room lined with portraits of stern ancestors, whose eyes seemed to judge every action. She entered quietly, expecting a routine lesson in decorum, but instead was met with a chilling declaration. He had arranged a marriage for her, not with a young suitor of her choosing, but with an elderly man from a neighboring county, a widower of considerable wealth, known for his rigid manners and unsympathetic nature. Eleanor's heart sank immediately. She had heard whispers of the man, Mr. Silas Granger, a man nearly 4 decades her senior, whose reputation was one of cold pragmatism. He had little regard for the emotions of others and was rumored to be harsh with those under his control. Jonathan's voice, calm but unyielding, delivered the verdict with no room for argument. "This is for the good of the family, Eleanor. I expect your full compliance." The words landed like a hammer. Eleanor struggled to form a response, the weight of betrayal settling in her chest. She tried to reason, to plead, to remind her father of her own desires, but he would not budge. "De Hawthorne does not question the plans of her father," he said sharply. "You will honor this arrangement, for your future, for our family, and for the legacy we uphold." As she left the study, her mind raced with a storm of emotions. The estate that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed a prison. Eleanor's youth, her dreams, and her hopes for love were already slipping away, replaced by the cold mechanics of societal expectation. Her father, oblivious to her suffering, moved on to logistical concerns, the dowry, the arrangements with Mr. Granger, and the timing of the engagement. The days that followed were cruel in subtle ways. Jonathan made a show of introducing Eleanor to the man he had chosen, arranging meetings in which he praised Mr. Granger's experience, wisdom and wealth. Eleanor, meanwhile, was reduced to polite nods and hollow smiles, forced to endure conversations about inheritance, property, and alliances. Her protests were met with thinly veiled disdain. "You are too young to understand the responsibilities of your station," her father would say. "But you will in time." Even within the walls of her own home, Eleanor found no refuge. The servants, loyal to Jonathan, treated her with a distance she had never known. Their whispered sympathies were drowned out by her father's constant presence, always watching, always directing, always reminding her of the plans she could not escape. Nights were the hardest. Alone in her chamber, she wept quietly, pressing her hand to the cold window pane as she stared at the moonlit fields, wondering if there would ever be a place where her voice could matter. Jonathan's cruelty was not only in the arrangement itself, but in the relentless reinforcement of his control. He had begun to limit Eleanor's correspondence with friends, monitoring letters and occasionally forbidding certain names from appearing in her life. He selected her wardrobe, controlled her meals, and even decided the time she could walk in the gardens. Every choice, every small moment, was subjected to his scrutiny. The psychological weight of this domination pressed upon Eleanor, leaving her fragile and anxious, yet outwardly composed as her father demanded. The villagers and neighboring families were aware of the arrangement, and gossip began to circulate. Some expressed sympathy for Eleanor, though most kept their distance, fearful of angering a man as influential as Jonathan Hawthorne. Eleanor's friends attempted to speak to her, to offer comfort, but she was increasingly isolated. She felt trapped in a world where her father's will was law, where her desires were irrelevant, and where her future had been decided without her consent. It was during one of these moments of despair that Eleanor noticed a small glimmer of defiance in herself. In the quiet of her room, she began to imagine a life beyond the plantation, a world in which she could make her own choices, where love could exist on her terms. She dreamed of leaving Virginia, of escaping the grasp of her father, and of finding someone who could see her as more than a tool for social ambition. But these dreams were fragile and fleeting, because the reality outside her imagination was unyielding. Jonathan, sensing perhaps that his daughter's spirit might resist, intensified his oversight. He arranged for tutors to drill her in etiquette, letters of introduction, and social strategy, all the while ensuring she had no privacy. He spoke to her about duty and legacy daily, never letting her forget that her obedience was tied to the honor of the Hawthorne name. The cruelty of this enforcement was psychological and relentless, a calculated shaping of Eleanor's will into conformity. Yet the human heart resists in ways that cannot always be measured. Eleanor, though constrained, began to cultivate small acts of subtle rebellion. She would linger over books longer than allowed, secretly sketch scenes of life beyond the estate, and exchange brief coded messages with friends. These acts, while minor, were her first silent protest, a refusal to surrender entirely to her father's dominion. Even in the shadow of coercion, the seed of resistance was planted, though she dared not yet hope for its growth. As winter approached, the preparations for her engagement intensified. Jonathan arranged the details with meticulous care, ensuring that Mr. Granger would see Eleanor only under his supervision. The contrast between the girl's youth and vitality and the old man's rigidity became starkly evident. During their formal introductions, Mr. Granger, though polite, carried himself with a stiffness that made Eleanor shiver. He spoke in measured tones, discussing finances, estates, and duty, oblivious to the trembling girl before him. Jonathan watched with satisfaction, believing he had engineered the perfect arrangement, a marriage that would cement his daughter's obedience and his legacy. Yet in the quiet corners of the estate, whispers of unease stirred. Eleanor's governess, an older woman who had served the family for decades, began to notice the toll the arrangement was taking on the girl. She watched Eleanor's smiles fade, observed the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching, and feared for the young woman's spirit. Her advice, however, fell on deaf ears. Jonathan dismissed concern with a wave of his hand, asserting that discipline and preparation were necessary for a Hawthorne to survive in the world. One evening, as the snow began to coat the fields in white, Eleanor sat by the fireplace, her journal open but untouched. She listened to the wind howl against the shutters and felt an unfamiliar chill of despair. The walls of the estate seemed to close in around her, and the distant laughter of servants reminded her of a world she no longer had access to. In that moment, Eleanor understood the depth of her father's cruelty. Not only in forcing a marriage she did not want, but in shaping every day of her existence to erase her agency. The realization was bitter, yet it ignited a spark of determination. She would endure, she resolved, but she would also find a way to survive this tyranny of expectation. Thus ended the first season of her youth, the moment before the storm that would define her life. The Hawthorne estate remained a bastion of wealth and control, a stage upon which Jonathan Hawthorne played his designs. Eleanor, young and fragile, was now caught in a web of manipulation, obedience and subtle cruelty, unaware that fate had begun its own designs and that the story of her suffering and the eventual reckoning was only beginning. The days following Eleanor's formal introduction to Silas Granger became increasingly oppressive. Each morning began with a rigid routine dictated by her father, and each evening ended with the heavy realization that her life was no longer her own. Jonathan's control was subtle yet absolute. He believed that by shaping every aspect of her behavior, he could mold Eleanor into a perfect reflection of the Hawthorne legacy. But in reality, he was eroding the girl's spirit. Eleanor, once full of curiosity and gentle warmth, now moved like a shadow through the house, careful to avoid missteps that could bring her father's wrath. Jonathan had arranged that Eleanor meet Silas more frequently. Every encounter reminded her of the gulf between their ages, their experiences and their desires. Silas, courteous yet distant, spoke of property, investments, and political connections. He made no attempt to engage Eleanor in conversation beyond matters that mattered to him. Each discussion, each measured tone, reinforced Eleanor's sense of helplessness. Jonathan observed these interactions with satisfaction, interpreting Eleanor's discomfort as the proper recognition of her position and duty. The isolation began to weigh on her, the few friends she had among the neighboring families could only offer small comforts, as any overt assistance risked angering Jonathan. Letters she sent were read before being sent, and replies were dictated, monitored and often delayed. Eleanor's world contracted to the walls of the estate, the hallways echoing with the authority of her father, the measured steps of Silas, and the quiet compliance of the servants, who had learned long ago that defiance brought punishment. Every aspect of her life had been arranged to enforce submission. Jonathan's cruelty was not confined to physical control or scheduling. He began to impose psychological trials, testing Eleanor's obedience and resilience. Minor mistakes were amplified. A misplaced item or delayed response drew long lectures on discipline, duty, and the consequences of failure. Eleanor, who had once been praised for her intelligence and kindness, now faced criticism at every turn. Her self-confidence eroded, replaced with a cautious, almost fearful demeanor. She began to measure her words before speaking, her gestures before acting, anticipating her father's disapproval at every moment. The arrival of winter deepened the tension within the estate. Fires burned in every room, yet the warmth they offered could not soothe the cold that had settled in Eleanor's heart. Jonathan continued to plan and dictate her every move, discussing the engagement as though Eleanor were an object rather than a person. He arranged for her to practice social graces, to write letters of introduction, and to memorize lists of acceptable topics for conversation, all to prepare her for a life she had not chosen. Every lesson, every correction was a reminder that her autonomy had been taken. The psychological burden was compounded by the increasing presence of Silas. He began to attend dinner regularly, his age and demeanor casting a shadow over the once lively table. Conversations became formal and constrained, leaving Eleanor to navigate the delicate balance of politeness and internal rebellion. Silas, oblivious to Eleanor's distress, spoke of duty and legacy, often praising Jonathan's foresight. Eleanor forced smiles and polite replies, but inside she felt a simmering resentment. Her father's vision of propriety was suffocating, and the world he had built around her seemed more prison than home. Eleanor's governess watched these developments with growing concern. She had served the family faithfully for decades and had witnessed Jonathan's temperament firsthand. She noticed the subtle changes in Eleanor, the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes no longer lingered on beauty or light, the hesitation in her speech. She tried to offer comfort, suggesting small acts of defiance to maintain Eleanor's spirit, such as private walks or secret sketches of the outside world. Eleanor embraced these moments quietly, finding fleeting relief in small liberties, yet always aware that discovery could bring severe punishment. The estate itself seemed to conspire against Eleanor's sense of freedom. The gardens, once a place of joy and exploration, were now carefully monitored. Paths she had walked freely were blocked, gates locked, and servants posted to ensure compliance with her father's orders. Every corner of the property reinforced Jonathan's control, a constant reminder that her life was orchestrated for the benefit of others rather than herself. Eleanor learned to navigate the estate with caution, always aware of the gaze of her father and the presence of Silas. During this period, Eleanor began to notice the deeper consequences of Jonathan's choices. The servants, once warm and protective, were now distant, afraid to offer comfort or companionship. Friends, aware of the social repercussions, avoided contact, leaving Eleanor increasingly isolated. The human connections that had once sustained her were severed, and the weight of this social exile pressed heavily upon her. She began to understand that her father's ambition was not simply a private cruelty, but a force that affected every relationship in her life. The engagement preparations reached a point where Eleanor could no longer deny the reality of her situation. She was to be married to a man decades her senior, a man who valued property and social standing more than compassion or understanding. The thought of a future constrained by Silas's control and her father's expectations filled her with dread. Eleanor's dreams of love and freedom felt increasingly distant, almost imaginary, as she confronted the unyielding structures around her. Jonathan, seeing no resistance, grew more confident. He began to involve Eleanor in discussions about the future, as if she were an equal partner. Though her input was irrelevant, he spoke of dowries, inheritances and alliances, treating her like a negotiable asset. Every word, every plan, further reinforced Eleanor's awareness that she was trapped in a system designed to benefit others at her expense. The psychological toll deepened, leaving her anxious, wary, and increasingly resigned. Amid these pressures, Eleanor's internal defiance persisted. Though it took subtle forms, she continued to sketch the landscapes outside the estate walls, capturing scenes of life she would never experience. She wrote private notes to herself, small reflections on freedom and hope, and treasured moments of quiet rebellion that no one could see. These acts, while insignificant in the eyes of her father, were a lifeline for Eleanor, a way to assert a fragment of self in a world determined to erase it. The contrast between Eleanor's inner life and the external demands placed upon her became stark. Within, she nurtured dreams of escape, of love untainted by duty or coercion. Outside, she was compelled to navigate the rigid expectations of her father and the cold indifference of Silas. Every step, every conversation, every moment of forced politeness was a reminder of the power dynamics that governed her existence. Eleanor became increasingly aware that survival required both outward compliance and internal resistance, a delicate balance that demanded constant vigilance. As winter deepened, so did the consequences of Jonathan's cruelty. Eleanor's health began to show signs of stress, pale cheeks, restless nights, and a persistent sense of fatigue. The psychological strain manifested physically, a testament to the relentless pressure imposed upon her. Servants whispered among themselves, concerned but powerless, as Jonathan remained oblivious, confident that discipline and control were ensuring the proper upbringing of a Hawthorne daughter. The subtle cruelty of his methods, once unnoticed, had begun to leave visible marks. Despite this, Eleanor's resilience showed in small acts. She maintained her composure during meals, endured the rehearsed interactions with Silas, and continued to practice the social graces her father demanded. Yet beneath the surface, her mind remained active, assessing, imagining, and planning. She became adept at masking distress, learning the art of silent endurance. This resilience was not triumph but survival, a fragile thread that allowed her to continue in the face of mounting oppression. The estate itself mirrored the tension within Eleanor. The halls, once filled with laughter and life, echoed with the careful steps of those aware of Jonathan's gaze. Rooms that had been places of comfort became stages for demonstration of obedience. The library, where Eleanor once found solace, was now a site of instruction and correction. The gardens, carefully pruned and monitored, no longer offered freedom. Every space within the estate was a constant reinforcement of control, a physical manifestation of Jonathan's authority, and the cruelty embedded within it. The presence of Silas Granger added another layer to the complexity of Eleanor's existence. He was polite but distant, discussing matters of property and legacy rather than companionship. Eleanor learned to navigate his presence, balancing the politeness expected of her with the internal desire to resist. These encounters, though limited in frequency, reinforced the gap between her youthful expectations and the reality imposed upon her. Each meeting was a reminder of the years that separated them and the life she would be forced to lead. As winter gave way to early spring, the psychological tension began to manifest more strongly. Eleanor's thoughts increasingly revolved around escape, autonomy, and the possibility of a different life. She contemplated the risks, aware that any misstep could result in punishment or further restriction. Yet the very act of thinking about a different path was a form of defiance, a subtle assertion of self that Jonathan could neither see nor control completely. The stage was set for the unfolding of deeper consequences. Eleanor's isolation, the relentless pressure of her father's expectations, and the presence of Silas created an environment in which cruelty could escalate and the seeds of regret could take root. The psychological groundwork laid during these months would later magnify the impact of decisions made by Jonathan, Silas, and Eleanor herself. The story, already heavy with manipulation and suffering, was only beginning to reveal the full weight of its cruelty. By the end of this period, Eleanor had learned to navigate the constraints imposed upon her. Yet the cost was visible in her demeanor, her health and the quiet sorrow in her eyes. She was trapped between compliance and desire, obedience and defiance, youth and the enforced responsibilities of adulthood. The escalating cruelty of Jonathan, combined with the cold presence of Silas, created a pressure cooker environment, setting the stage for the eventual reckoning that would bring consequences, regret, and moral revelation. Eleanor's spirit remained unbroken, but it had been tested in ways that would shape every choice she made in the months and years to come. Spring came slowly to the Hawthorne estate, bringing with it a deceptive sense of renewal. The gardens bloomed, the air grew warmer, and the sun cast long golden rays across the plantation. To an outsider, it might have seemed as if life had returned to normal. But within the walls of the estate, tension was thick and silent. Eleanor's world remained a carefully controlled cage. Her father's authority, previously strict and obvious, now showed its deeper, subtler forms. Every move she made was scrutinized, every word measured. The psychological pressure that had begun months before was now compounded, leaving Eleanor wary, anxious, and more tightly constrained than ever. Jonathan Hawthorne had begun involving Eleanor in matters that, on the surface, appeared innocuous, but were in fact extensions of his cruelty. He tasked her with supervising certain servants, testing her ability to enforce rules and maintain order. These responsibilities, while framed as preparation for her role as a wife, exposed her to power dynamics she was ill-equipped to navigate. Eleanor felt the weight of authority she neither desired nor had consented to. In carrying out these tasks, she saw firsthand the human cost of obedience and control, the small resentments and subtle fear that permeated those around her. Jonathan observed with satisfaction, believing he was cultivating strength, but in truth, he was training Eleanor in the art of compliance, eroding her innocence and leaving her isolated. The relationship with Silas Granger, though still formal, had begun to shift subtly. He visited the estate more frequently, sometimes joining Jonathan during meals, sometimes speaking with Eleanor alone under strict supervision. While Silas remained distant and impersonal, Eleanor began to perceive the small ways in which age and rigidity could magnify cruelty. He commented on her posture, on the timeliness of her responses, and on the propriety of her demeanor. These were not acts of overt malice, but the cumulative effect was oppressive. Eleanor found herself constantly tense, every gesture weighed and measured, every word chosen with care to avoid reprimand or criticism. Isolation deepened its grip. Eleanor's friends had grown accustomed to maintaining distance. Gossip and social expectations had created invisible walls around her, making her feel trapped even beyond the physical confines of the estate. Letters from friends, once a source of comfort, were filtered and censored. Eleanor's governess continued to offer subtle solace, but even she was constrained. Wary of Jonathan's scrutiny, the few moments of private reflection Eleanor could claim were precious and fleeting. She wrote in her journal, sketched hidden landscapes, and allowed herself the luxury of dreaming, but always under the constant shadow of discovery. The impact on Eleanor's spirit was gradual but undeniable. Her confidence, once evident in her smile and her curiosity, had dimmed. She began to speak less freely, to ask fewer questions, and to avoid drawing attention. Her once lively expressions became muted, replaced with a careful neutrality. This was a form of survival, a shield against the relentless pressure of her father and the world he had imposed. Yet it came at a cost. Eleanor was learning the harsh reality that obedience, even when it preserved safety, could erode identity. The tension between her inner desires and outward compliance created a quiet, persistent sorrow, an emotional strain she could neither release nor fully articulate. Jonathan, for his part, was unaware of the hidden consequences taking shape. He continued to enforce rules with a precise hand, arranging lessons, interactions, and routines designed to maximize obedience. He introduced more structured social instruction, teaching Eleanor the expectations of young women of her station, and rehearsed the kinds of conversations she might have with Silas. Each day reinforced the idea that her life was preordained, her choices secondary. Jonathan took pride in what he saw as preparation for the future, blind to the erosion of Eleanor's autonomy and the quiet, resentment growing within her. The subtle cruelty of Jonathan's design extended to the smallest details. Eleanor's clothing was selected for appearance and propriety, often at the expense of comfort. Meals were structured not for nourishment, but for decorum, with precise etiquette expected at each course. Her social interactions were choreographed, leaving little room for spontaneity or personal expression. Even leisure, once a sanctuary, was monitored and restricted. Every corner of Eleanor's existence was under constant observation, the invisible hand of her father shaping her behavior, her thoughts, and her perception of self. As Eleanor navigated this environment, she began to observe the effects on those around her. The servants, once familiar and warm, now maintained distance, fear tempered by years of experience. Visitors behaved cautiously, polite but reserved. Eleanor could see in their eyes the awareness of her father's controlling nature, and in that recognition, she understood the reach of his power. She saw how control extended beyond her own life, shaping the lives and actions of everyone within the estate. The cruelty was not only personal. It was systemic, insidious, and far-reaching. Eleanor's private thoughts became a refuge and a battlefield. She contemplated the injustice of her situation, the imbalance between her youth and Silas's age, and the relentless authority of her father. She considered the possibility of resistance, but the risks were clear. Defiance could lead to punishment, further isolation, or a tightening of the restrictions already imposed. Eleanor weighed the desire for autonomy against the practical necessity of survival, creating a complex internal calculus that drained her energy and tested her spirit. One afternoon, Jonathan arranged for Eleanor to accompany him on a visit to the neighboring estate where Silas maintained property. The journey was carefully orchestrated, every interaction monitored, every conversation scripted. Eleanor observed the dynamics between Silas and the estate staff, noting his rigidity and lack of empathy. The contrast between his demeanor and her father's expectation of compliance was stark. She realized with a growing sense of dread that her future would be defined not by love or choice, but by power, control, and the unyielding expectations of men who valued status over humanity. This realization brought early consequences. Eleanor's health and emotional state began to reflect the intensity of her psychological burden. She experienced sleepless nights, fatigue, and periods of anxiety. The subtle cruelty that had seemed theoretical in earlier months now manifested, physically and mentally. Her governess, observing these changes, grew more concerned. She offered counsel and comfort, encouraging Eleanor to maintain small acts of private resistance and to preserve her inner world. Eleanor clung to these suggestions, understanding that while outward obedience was necessary, the preservation of her identity required quiet, steadfast defiance. The pattern of cruelty, compliance, and hidden consequence extended to every social interaction. Guests at the estate were carefully managed, with Jonathan orchestrating conversations to reinforce Eleanor's subservience. Praise was rare, and when it came, it was measured and conditional. Eleanor learned to navigate these interactions with precision, balancing civility with the inner turmoil that continued to grow. She became adept at masking distress, a skill that allowed her to maintain appearances while safeguarding her private thoughts and dreams. Throughout this period, Eleanor's sense of time became intertwined with her father's expectations. Days were regimented, measured by the routines and obligations imposed upon her. The future, once an open landscape of possibility, now appeared as a series of constraints and obligations. The realization of her predetermined path intensified her anxiety, creating a constant tension between her internal desires and external demands. The hidden consequences of Jonathan's cruelty were manifesting not only in her present discomfort, but in her anticipation of a life devoid of autonomy and emotional fulfillment. Eleanor's relationship with Silas continued to highlight these tensions. While he remained distant, polite, and disinterested in her personal feelings, his presence served as a living reminder of her father's control. Each meeting reinforced the inevitability of the engagement and the depth of her subjugation. Eleanor began to notice the subtle ways in which power and age could compound cruelty, not through active malice, but through indifference, rigidity, and expectation. The emotional impact was profound, leaving her with a sense of helplessness that contrasted sharply with her inner desire for freedom. In private moments, Eleanor reflected on the nature of her father's cruelty and the consequences it had set in motion. She understood that Jonathan's obsession with status, wealth, and legacy had transformed her life into a series of obligations and tests. The human cost was evident in her own spirit, in the distance she observed in others, and in the quiet, measured interactions that now defined her existence. These reflections, though painful, allowed Eleanor to begin conceptualizing a strategy for enduring the hardships imposed upon her. She recognized that survival would require patience, careful observation, and the cultivation of resilience. The cumulative effect of these months was clear. Eleanor had endured the early imposition of control, learned the patterns of her father's cruelty, and begun to navigate the complex web of expectations surrounding her. The hidden consequences were now apparent: diminished health, emotional strain, social isolation, and a growing awareness of the oppressive structures defining her life. Yet amidst these challenges, Eleanor's inner defiance persisted. Her imagination, private acts of creation, and subtle rebellion offered a lifeline, preserving the core of her identity against the relentless pressure of compliance. By the close of this period, Eleanor had reached a delicate equilibrium. She understood the depth of her father's power and the inevitability of her impending marriage. She had internalized the lessons of obedience, learned the art of measured compliance, and developed strategies for preserving fragments of her selfhood. The escalation of cruelty had begun to reveal its consequences, both visible and hidden, shaping Eleanor's perception of the world and her place within it. The stage was now set for further escalation, where the intersection of cruelty, consequence, and regret would continue to unfold, bringing the story closer to the irreversible turning points that awaited her in the months to come. As the warmth of spring deepened, Eleanor's life became heavier under the control of her father. Jonathan Hawthorne had planned every detail of her existence, and the engagement to Silas Granger loomed like a shadow she could not escape. The subtle pressures of the past months now became visible consequences. Every step she took, every word she spoke, every gesture she made was measured and controlled. Eleanor's once free spirit was now burdened with tension, fear, and the constant awareness of the path laid before her. Engagement preparations intensified. Jonathan orchestrated meetings with neighbors, family, friends, and associates of Silas. Every interaction reminded Eleanor of the future imposed on her. The strain began to affect her body. Sleepless nights, headaches, and exhaustion became a daily reality. Even small tasks, once simple, were now exercises in endurance and precision. Jonathan's enforcement of propriety was relentless, and Eleanor's mind and body began to show the toll. Silas Granger's visits increased. Though polite, he scrutinized Eleanor constantly, correcting her posture, her speech, even minor habits. He spoke of duty, legacy, and propriety, ignoring her feelings entirely. Eleanor endured silently, aware that any resistance would be seen as defiance and punished. Between her father's planning and Silas's rigid presence, Eleanor's world was confined, structured and oppressive. Isolation became deeper. Friends grew hesitant to visit. The staff, already cautious, acted with increasing tension. Letters and communications from the outside world were filtered or delayed. Eleanor relied on the governess for comfort and guidance. Together they created small, private spaces where Eleanor could write, sketch, and reflect. These secret acts were her only way to preserve a sense of herself amid the constant control. The consequences of Jonathan's cruelty now reached into Eleanor's physical and emotional health. Her cheeks lost color, her shoulders carried tension, and fatigue lingered in her movements. Each smile became harder to muster. Each polite conversation with Silas or with guests drained her. The once lively and bright girl now moved with care and caution, always aware of the gaze upon her. Her freedom, choices, and even small joys were gone. Eleanor also began to perceive the wider impact of her father's decisions. The household itself seemed tense, the staff wary, the neighbors distant. Jonathan's obsession with status and control was not only harming Eleanor, it was affecting everyone connected to the estate. The subtle consequences of cruelty extended beyond her life, shaping the emotional atmosphere of the entire household. Even in private, Eleanor's thoughts were heavy. She reflected on the injustice she faced, the gap between her desires and the life imposed upon her, and the inevitability of marrying a man she could not love. Regret began to surface, though it was not entirely her own. She mourned the life she might have had, the relationships curtailed, and the control she had lost. These reflections, though painful, strengthened her inner awareness and determination to endure. As spring turned toward summer, Eleanor had settled into a fragile balance. She navigated her father's expectations, Silas's presence, and the demands of society with careful composure. Her acts of subtle rebellion, writing, sketching, reflecting, remained her lifeline, small proofs that her spirit still existed beneath the weight of obedience. Yet the consequences of her father's cruelty were undeniable. Her body, mind, and social connections bore the marks of months of strict control and relentless oversight. Eleanor's life was one of tension, endurance, and growing awareness of the cost of her father's ambitions. The consequences of cruelty were now tangible, and hints of regret had begun to take hold. The story was moving toward deeper struggles, further emotional fallout, and moral reckonings that would shape the rest of her life. Please tell us in the comments where you are watching from. If you liked this story, press the like button to show it. The late summer sun lay heavy over the Hawthorne estate, casting long shadows across the gardens and the manor. Eleanor moved slowly through the halls, careful to maintain composure, under the watchful eyes of her father and Silas Granger. The weight of her circumstances had settled deep in her chest. She had endured months of psychological pressure, forced obedience, and the growing reality of a life that would belong to another man. Yet the strain of this existence now began to show more clearly in her mind and body. Each morning began with ritualized routines dictated by Jonathan. He oversaw every detail, from the time Eleanor rose from her bed to the careful arrangement of her attire. Even her meals were structured, with Jonathan noting any deviation from manners he deemed proper. Eleanor obeyed silently, her heart heavy, her movements careful, but each act of compliance carried an invisible cost. It was no longer just the loss of freedom. It was the accumulation of exhaustion, frustration, and quiet sorrow. Her spirit had been tested beyond endurance, and yet she continued to endure, hiding the turmoil from the world. Silas Granger's visits grew more frequent, his interactions polite but exacting. He observed Eleanor's posture, the tone of her speech and the smallest gestures, correcting her, as though she were merely an apprentice in his own household. While he showed no overt malice, the subtlety of his criticisms carried a weight far heavier than a simple reprimand. Eleanor found herself shrinking under his attention, internalizing each comment, each correction, as a reminder of the future she was forced to accept. His presence became a constant reminder that the life she might have dreamed of, filled with freedom, choice, and companionship, was slipping further from her reach. The isolation Eleanor felt deepened. Friends from neighboring estates began to visit less frequently, cautious of Jonathan's expectations and the gossip that could follow any perceived impropriety. The staff, already vigilant, became increasingly reserved, speaking softly and moving cautiously. Eleanor noticed the change in their eyes. Subtle fear, careful calculation, and the weight of her father's authority reflected in their movements. She understood, perhaps for the first time in a full measure, that her father's cruelty extended beyond her own life and touched everyone around her. The walls of the estate seemed to echo with this tension, every corner a reminder that her choices were no longer her own. Despite these pressures, Eleanor continued to cling to small acts of personal defiance. In the privacy of her room, she wrote letters that were never sent, sketched the fields beyond the estate walls, and allowed herself moments of quiet imagination. These acts, though minor, were essential for preserving her sense of identity. They offered fleeting relief, a reminder that she could still exist as someone separate from the carefully constructed expectations imposed on her. Yet even these moments were tinged with sorrow, for each act of freedom highlighted the vast difference between the life she imagined and the life she was living. The consequences of Jonathan's control began to manifest more starkly. Eleanor's health showed signs of the cumulative strain. Pale skin, restless nights, and a persistent weariness marked her once vibrant appearance. Her thoughts often dwelled on what could have been, friendships restricted, freedom curtailed, joys denied. Each reflection deepened her sense of loss. These were not simply regrets for missed opportunities, but a growing awareness of the human cost of her father's obsession with status and legacy. Eleanor began to see that the cruelty she endured was systemic, shaping not only her life, but the lives of all those around her. Social events orchestrated by Jonathan served to heighten the sense of emotional strain. Guests arrived at the estate with measured politeness, aware of Eleanor's position and her father's expectations. Each gathering required Eleanor to perform, to smile, to speak graciously, and to conceal the turmoil in her heart. The contrast between the outward appearances she was compelled to maintain and the inner Despair, she felt, was exhausting. Every interaction became a test, and every misstep, however small, carried the weight of judgment. In these moments, Eleanor felt the true depth of her father's control, the way it demanded not only compliance, but also the suppression of self. The engagement to Silas cast a long shadow over Eleanor's thoughts. She understood the reality of the arrangement more fully now. A life bound to a man decades older, a future shaped by property and status rather than affection or understanding. The awareness of her limited choices brought fresh pangs of regret. She mourned not only the loss of her autonomy, but also the absence of companionship, love and youthful dreams. These emotions, quietly simmering, became a persistent undertone to every day, coloring interactions, movements and reflections. Eleanor also observed the emotional impact on those around her. The staff, servants who had once spoken freely or smiled easily, now moved in careful patterns of caution. Their interactions were brief and calculated, the air tense with the knowledge of what could follow a misstep. Neighbors and friends, too, acted cautiously, visiting less often and speaking more formally. The cruelty imposed by Jonathan rippled outward, touching lives beyond his immediate control. Eleanor understood that the consequences of her father's ambitions extended far beyond herself, and this realization added weight to her growing sense of sorrow and moral awareness. Her governess continued to be a source of quiet counsel and support, encouraging Eleanor to nurture her inner life despite the restrictions imposed on her. Together, they found brief moments of solace in shared reflection, discussion of literature, and secret creative pursuits. These moments were fragile but crucial, preserving Eleanor's mental and emotional resilience. They allowed her to maintain a thread of personal identity, even as external circumstances continued to tighten around her. Throughout this period, Eleanor's awareness of consequences grew sharper. She recognized that obedience, though necessary for survival, carried a cost: the erosion of her identity, the suppression of natural desires, and the internalization of fear and restraint. She began to anticipate the long-term effects of her father's actions, understanding that her life would be defined not by her choices, but by the priorities of Jonathan and Silas. This foresight intensified the weight of regret, creating a layered, persistent emotional strain that pervaded every day. The combination of physical, emotional, and social pressures produced a subtle but growing fragility. Eleanor's body reflected the strain: slight tremors in her hands, fatigue in her movements, and weariness in her posture. Her mind, though resilient, bore the weight of constant vigilance and anticipation. The future she had once imagined, a life of freedom, joy, and choice, was no longer attainable. Each day of compliance reinforced the reality of her restricted existence and the consequences of her father's relentless pursuit of social and economic advantage. By the end of this stage, Eleanor had endured months of increasingly oppressive control. The heightening of regret and emotional fallout was undeniable. She had learned to mask distress in public, to preserve composure in the face of scrutiny, and to sustain herself through private acts of reflection and creativity. Yet the consequences of her father's cruelty were visible in her weakened health, her cautious interactions, and the quiet sorrow that accompanied even the simplest moments of her life. The story of Eleanor's existence had moved from strict obedience into a more complex web of consequence, moral awareness, and emotional strain. The summer faded into early autumn, leaving Eleanor with a sense of inevitability and mounting burden. Each day she navigated the expectations of her father, the rigid presence of Silas, and the cautious behavior of those around her. Her inner defiance remained, a fragile thread of resilience, but the cumulative weight of obedience and regret pressed ever more heavily upon her. She understood more fully than ever that survival would require constant vigilance, careful calculation, and the preservation of even the smallest fragments of personal freedom. Eleanor's reflections during this time deepened her understanding of moral consequence. She considered the broader implications of her father's decisions, recognizing how the pursuit of status and wealth had caused harm not only to her, but to others in the household and community. The emotional fallout of these decisions was widespread, touching those who lived under Jonathan's authority, those who depended on his household, and even those who observed the unfolding events from a distance. Her awareness of these connections heightened her sense of sorrow and ethical understanding. Eleanor's life was defined by endurance and reflection. The physical, emotional, and social consequences of her father's control were evident, and the threads of regret were now deeply woven into her daily experience. She had endured months of sustained pressure, navigated complex social expectations, and maintained a fragile inner world despite the weight of obedience. The stage was now set for the next phase of the story, where the consequences of cruelty would become irreversible. Emotional tension would peak, and the moral reckoning for Jonathan and those around him would begin to unfold. Eleanor moved quietly through the rooms she had once roamed freely, each corner now echoing with the weight of months of control. Jonathan's hand was everywhere, every routine, every conversation, every expectation, but the consequences of his decisions were beginning to take on a form that could no longer be ignored. Eleanor understood with a quiet horror that much of her life had already passed beyond her ability to shape it. Silas Granger appeared more frequently now, sometimes for hours, sometimes for the entire afternoon. His presence, while outwardly civil, carried a subtle insistence that Eleanor obey, adapt, and comply with the life mapped out for her. Even minor gestures, the slightest hesitation in her step, or a brief frown drew his notice and quiet correction. Eleanor felt herself shrinking under his gaze. The freedom she had once secretly claimed through sketches and private reflections now felt more distant than ever. Jonathan's scrutiny became relentless. He monitored her dress, her posture, and the way she spoke to anyone within the household. Even moments that had previously been private, reading quietly in her room, sketching landscapes or writing letters never sent, had to be done with care. Every act of independence, however small, risked exposure and correction. Eleanor's inner defiance persisted, but the emotional cost of maintaining it increased each day. The life she might have chosen had been systematically removed, replaced with a rigid framework designed to suppress her spirit entirely. The household itself seemed transformed under the pressure. Servants moved cautiously, their conversations hushed, their eyes quick to judge and measure Eleanor's behavior. The energy that had once filled the estate with laughter and light conversation was replaced by tension and silence. Eleanor noticed how even her friends from neighboring estates treated her differently, with increased formality and distant politeness. She began to feel the profound social cost of her father's choices, how his obsession with reputation and control extended beyond her and shaped the behavior of everyone around her. Physically, Eleanor began to show the strain of prolonged stress. Sleep eluded her most nights, leaving her exhausted and restless. Fatigue made simple tasks harder, and her hands sometimes shook when she moved quickly or carried items. Even small interactions with Silas or guests seemed to draw energy she no longer had to give. Her health reflected the consequences of months of imposed obedience, psychological tension, and emotional suppression. The invisible weight she carried had now become visible to anyone who looked carefully. Moral reckoning entered Eleanor's mind with increasing intensity. She reflected on her father's actions, the engagement to Silas, and the broader implications of obedience enforced through cruelty. Jonathan had framed his decisions as protecting the family legacy. But Eleanor now understood the deep cost, her own suffering, the fear and tension imposed on servants, and the erosion of meaningful social connections. She felt sorrow, anger, and confusion at the relentless focus on property and status over human feeling. The moral dimension of her father's cruelty was impossible to ignore. The consequences were no longer abstract. They were lived experiences. The estate itself carried the weight of these consequences. The halls, once filled with warmth, now felt measured and constrained. Every social visit, meal, and conversation had become a performance of compliance. Even the smallest gestures carried consequence. Eleanor's laughter was quieter, more careful. Her interactions more calculated. Friends and neighbors observed the transformation, adjusting their behavior accordingly. The social structure around Eleanor had shifted entirely, under the weight of her father's ambitions, and she bore witness to the far-reaching effects of cruelty beyond her own life. Eleanor's private life became a narrow space of refuge. She continued to write in journals, sketch hidden corners of the estate, and allow herself brief moments of imagination. These small acts of personal expression became precious lifelines. Each act of inner defiance reminded her of the life she might have had, the autonomy stripped from her, and the choices she had been denied. But even these private moments highlighted the permanence of her circumstances. While her thoughts could wander, her body and public life remained constrained. Tethered to the demands of Jonathan and Silas, the engagement preparations advanced relentlessly. Jonathan coordinated lawyers, estate managers, and social contacts, each step reinforcing Eleanor's lack of choice. The subtle cruelty of each arrangement, the formal agreements, the carefully staged social appearances, the insistence on propriety, left Eleanor feeling powerless. She could not undo these arrangements, and each day brought her closer to a life she had never consented to, but would be forced to inhabit. The consequences of obedience and enforced compliance were now permanent. Eleanor's thoughts often returned to the moral weight of her situation. She considered the effects on the servants, who moved with care to avoid punishment. She reflected on Silas, whose indifference mirrored the values of her father rather than her own. She recognized how control, once established, rippled outward to affect every life within its reach. The cruelty she endured was not isolated. It had consequences that could not be reversed. Eleanor's awareness of these broader effects intensified her sorrow and sharpened the sense of injustice she carried quietly. Despite the growing strain, Eleanor maintained a fragile resilience. The private rituals she had developed, the journals, sketches, and reflections, allowed her to survive emotionally and mentally. They offered a subtle assertion of self in the face of overwhelming external control. But each day reminded her that survival required patience, endurance, and careful navigation of a reality largely determined by others. The irreversible nature of her situation became increasingly clear. The choices she had lost could not be reclaimed, and the life she imagined had been permanently altered by her father's actions. The subtle escalation of consequences could be seen everywhere. Eleanor's health, her social interactions, her capacity for independent thought, and her sense of identity all bore the marks of control. Even her small acts of defiance carried risk, reminding her that the cost of survival was constant vigilance. Each day, the cumulative effect of obedience and suppression grew heavier, shaping her future in ways that could no longer be undone. The emotional impact deepened. Eleanor experienced a persistent sense of grief, mingled with frustration and quiet anger. The disparity between the life she had envisioned and the one imposed upon her weighed on her relentlessly. She saw the human cost of her father's pursuit of status, wealth and control reflected in herself, the staff, and the subtle distance of social acquaintances. The moral reckoning was no longer just an internal reflection. It had become a lived reality, shaping the estate and everyone connected to it. Every moment reinforced the permanence of her situation. Eleanor recognized that she could not change the past months or reclaim opportunities denied to her. Her defiance had always been private, constrained by fear, and she understood that the life her father orchestrated was now inevitable. Each social gathering, every formal instruction, and even the quiet surveillance of her movements contributed to a trajectory from which there was no turning back. Eleanor also reflected on the long-term emotional consequences. The strain, isolation, and suppression of autonomy had left marks on her psyche that would endure beyond immediate events. She understood that the path Jonathan had chosen for her would define not only the coming months but potentially the rest of her life. The irreversible nature of these consequences became a central awareness in her daily existence, a weight she carried silently, navigating the world carefully and deliberately. The estate, in its rigid order and formality, reflected the unchangeable structure imposed by Jonathan. Each correction, social expectation, and enforced ritual was part of a system that constrained freedom and magnified consequence. Eleanor's awareness of this system deepened, and with it, a moral understanding of the cost of power when exercised without empathy. The consequences of cruelty, she realized, extended far beyond the immediate act. They shaped lives, relationships, and futures permanently. Eleanor's private reflections provided clarity, even amid despair. She considered how obedience and compliance, while necessary for survival, carried deep and lasting consequences. She understood the human toll of authority, exercised without regard for personal autonomy. The emotional fallout, combined with the social and physical constraints imposed upon her, formed a reality she could no longer change. The moral reckoning had begun fully in her mind, a quiet but insistent awareness that would remain with her as her life progressed toward the engagement and the years that would follow. The Hawthorne estate lay quiet under the winter sky. Snow had begun to dust the fields beyond the manor, and the chill of February settled into every room. Eleanor moved slowly through the halls, feeling the weight of months of imposed control. Each step reminded her that her life had been shaped not by choice, but by the decisions of her father and the expectations of Silas Granger. The freedom she had once imagined now existed only in memory, fragile and distant, yet never entirely forgotten. The engagement to Silas had been formalized, as Jonathan intended. Legal documents, social arrangements, and public announcements cemented a future Eleanor had not chosen. The permanence of this reality settled over her with quiet inevitability. Even the smallest gestures, sitting at the table, walking through the garden, receiving visitors, carried the invisible weight of her lack of autonomy. The months of obedience, careful navigation, and private defiance had left an indelible mark on her body, mind, and spirit. Her days were structured by necessity. Meals, letters, and social visits followed precise routines, each dictated by expectation. Yet within the rhythm of imposed order, Eleanor carved small moments for herself. She wrote in journals that were never shared, sketched scenes of the estate, and allowed herself brief imaginings of a life where choice was hers. These private acts preserved a fragment of identity, even as the world outside continued to constrain her. They became essential, a quiet resistance to the life that had been forced upon her. The emotional impact of her father's decisions was profound. Eleanor reflected on how Jonathan's ambition and concern for social standing had produced suffering. Far beyond her own experience, servants moved carefully to avoid mistakes. Neighbors treated the family with cautious formality, and Silas acted with distant authority. Every interaction was marked by the consequences of control. Eleanor carried an understanding that cruelty, even subtle and measured, reshaped the lives of all involved. It left a trail of tension, fear, and sorrow that could not be undone. Despite the oppressive circumstances, Eleanor maintained dignity and poise. She had learned to navigate the demands placed upon her, to smile when required, to speak with care, and to conceal the turmoil in her mind. Her physical appearance bore subtle traces of stress, pale skin, tense shoulders, and restless nights, but her outward composure remained. She realized that survival demanded patience, attention, and quiet strength. Every small act of endurance became a statement of resilience in the face of forces beyond her control. Eleanor's reflection extended to the broader consequences of her father's choices. She considered the staff, who moved with caution to protect themselves, the neighbors, who interacted with her and the household with formality, and Silas, whose indifference highlighted the transactional nature of her engagement. She understood that Jonathan's pursuit of status had created a ripple effect. The human cost of ambition, control, and disregard for autonomy was evident everywhere she looked. It was a lesson she would carry long into the future. Even the quiet moments of the day were tinged with memory and regret. Walking through the gardens, Eleanor recalled the paths she had once explored freely. Sitting by the hearth, she remembered conversations that had been cut short, friendships never deepened, and laughter that had been replaced by obedience. These memories brought sorrow, but they also reinforced the inner strength she had cultivated. The contrast between past freedom and present constraint highlighted both loss and resilience, shaping Eleanor's understanding of human endurance. The moral weight of her experiences became increasingly clear. Eleanor recognized that her father's control was not merely personal, it was systemic. It affected the household, the estate, and the social network surrounding them. Decisions made without empathy carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate obedience. Eleanor's awareness of these effects heightened her sorrow, yet it also allowed her to reflect critically on human behavior, authority, and the cost of prioritizing ambition over compassion. Her relationship with Silas remained formal, distant, and constrained. He maintained oversight and instruction, but there was no affection or understanding beyond what was socially required. Eleanor often thought about the contrast between this engagement and the life she might have chosen freely. She grieved the absence of companionship, built on trust and mutual respect, replaced instead with obligation and status. The emotional fallout of this arrangement was subtle but persistent, shaping every interaction and every thought she carried. Even routine interactions carried layers of consequence. Meals with the family, conversations with staff, and visits from neighbors reminded Eleanor of the careful balance she had to maintain. Each gesture, word, and expression was measured, because deviation could draw scrutiny or correction. Her ability to navigate these constraints reflected a quiet intelligence and resilience, but it also underscored the cost of her father's decisions. The careful order he demanded reshaped not only her life but the lives of those who interacted with the household daily. Eleanor's private reflections became a form of moral reckoning. She considered the choices of her father and their effects on everyone connected to the estate. Cruelty, she understood, rarely existed in isolation. Its consequences spread, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully, shaping lives, relationships, and perceptions. Her experiences taught her to recognize the weight of authority, the responsibility inherent in power, and the cost of neglecting empathy. The lessons of her suffering were clear and enduring. Winter deepened, bringing longer nights and quiet solitude. Eleanor spent hours in reflection, thinking about the life she had lost, the autonomy denied, and the small victories of endurance she had achieved. She contemplated her future with a mixture of resignation and clarity. While she could not reclaim her past, she could preserve her dignity, integrity, and ability to reflect critically on the moral dimensions of human behavior. These reflections were a source of quiet strength, allowing her to move forward even within a life constrained by others. The sorrow Eleanor carried was profound. She felt grief for the opportunities denied, the friendships unformed, and the joys never experienced. Yet she also recognized the resilience she had cultivated. The months of obedience, careful observation, and subtle defiance had created an inner fortitude that could not be taken from her. Eleanor understood the permanence of her situation and accepted the limitations imposed on her, even as she grieved the life she might have lived. Through this awareness, Eleanor reached a form of closure. She had endured months of oppression, navigated irreversible consequences, and witnessed the ripple effects of cruelty. The engagement to Silas, while unchosen, would proceed, yet Eleanor's reflections had instilled a deeper understanding of morality, human behavior, and the enduring effects of decisions made without regard for others. She moved through her days with quiet composure, carrying the lessons of her experiences and the awareness of both regret and resilience. Even in the final moments of her reflection, Eleanor held onto the thread of private strength that had allowed her to survive. Her journals, sketches, and thoughts remained her own, a personal record of endurance and moral clarity. The consequences of her father's choices had reshaped her life, but they had not destroyed her ability to reflect, to understand, or to maintain a sense of personal dignity. These small yet enduring elements of self-preservation marked the culmination of her journey through suffering, consequence, and reflection. For those who have followed Eleanor's story, her experiences serve as a reminder that cruelty, ambition, and control carry lasting consequences. Obedience under pressure shapes lives in ways that are both visible and subtle. Reflection, awareness, and endurance provide a path through sorrow, regret, and moral reckoning. Eleanor's journey demonstrates that even when circumstances are harsh, human resilience and understanding can endure, preserving fragments of identity and integrity even in the face of irreversible events. If you have found Eleanor's story compelling, subscribe to the channel to follow more historical tales of consequence, morality, and human endurance.